number of thoughts with us just before the break, from skills development, challenges and living conditions for the workers, working together as a collective. And, I just wonder, when you sit in your office, what's the biggest problem that you think that you are facing as a minister, that if you could solve that one big problem, it would be a complete game changer?
The biggest challenge we have as a country, it's the question of making sure that we create appropriate skills for the mining industry. I know people will argue that we have, but these are some of the biggest challenges, because whatever potential we have, if we don't have the requisite skills as a country, we'll not be able to grow our minerals. Therefore, question of education becomes key. If you look at South Africans' biggest problems or challenge in the mining industry, where we are today, we are an industry which grows itself on the backbone of illiteracy. And we've got to move away from that. But also, one of the challenges for us linked to the issue of skills, it's how do we reposition South Africa within the global environment for us to continue to be competitive, but also in making sure that our mining industry is modernized. Those are the key challenges which we face as a country if we have to really make sure that we can compete with other mining jurisdictions.
All right, so the mining industry at large came together in Cape Town last week, and they were looking for clarity and certainty. Do you think you said enough?
Well, it will never be enough. I've said a lot, but there'll always be gaps in any situation. I mean, one of the issues which was of concern was the issue of the resource rent tax. I just want to say the question of taxation in South Africa will not happen in a way that will inhibit growth for our economy. And tax dispensation, we've had it for many, many years. It's there in many, many other countries. In fact, the world, governments operate on the basis of taxes. This particular one falls within that context. It's not just a tax dispensation which will be isolated. We don't deal with taxation as Department of Mineral Resources, but it's the jurisdiction of Treasury or Finance, because they've got the know-how. So if we have to implement any taxation for the mining industry, it has to be balanced, it has to make sure that it recognizes that this sector needs to grow. But the other factor, it has to recognize that there are other taxes already which prevails for businesses. So it cannot happen in isolation on the basis of that it will make us to be uncompetitive as a country. So I'm confident that Treasury at all times, like in the past, will respond adequately when it has to deal with mining taxes in this country.
One of the themes that came through, and when we talk to mining commentators and executives, they say that they want greater clarity, particularly in the regulatory framework. Are you clear and not being heard, or do you agree that perhaps some things could be clearer?
Well, it's clear. We have made proposals which allows all those who have interest and concerns to come forward in terms of those proposals, make their comments. So we have not reached a point where we have finalized the regulatory framework. We've gone through Cabinet. We're on the next phase of going to Parliament. Parliament is going to engage with everybody. And I just want once more to appeal to all those who are interested to come forward when the public hearings are held in Parliament and make their contribution. Because clarity, it's when people will be able to contribute towards that process. But if people sit back and not contribute, indeed, they will never understand. And I must say, even the proposals themselves are clear. What is it that we want to achieve as a country, but also as government, and where do we need to make amendments to the Act? As I said, some of them arises from the court decision, constitutional court decisions, but some arises from concerns which were raised. For instance, the issue of integration of a regulatory system when it comes to licensing. I must also indicate, globally, we will be the first country where you will get a mining license, environmental license, including water license, within 1 year. So that on its own, it's responding and making sure that we create certainty. Those are proposals, so people must come forward in addressing those issues and making their own contribution. But I am positive that we are on the right track as a country. Hopefully by end of this year, we'll have finalized our amendments and have once more a regulation which will be able to bring clarity and certainty.
One of the things that, sadly, when I speak to leadership sitting in this chair, we have a plethora of great ideas, fantastic legislation that's proposed, and some even put into place. But the challenge now becomes implementation and actually getting the job done. You talked about one-stop shop for licensing, but you promised prospecting licenses would be issued within 2 to 3 months, I think it was, a couple of years ago, and people are still waiting 3 years. So there's an implementation story, really, I think, that's playing out.
Well, this is a two-way process. It takes two to make it happen. You know, Peter, people make applications, they're incomplete, but we never reject those applications. We give them an opportunity to further submit. You'll find that the environmental management plan, it's not complete. You'll find that the financial guarantees are not there. So it's all those kind of issues.
But Minister, I mean, we're dealing with companies that, with all due respect, they've got consultants are very clever people, lawyers who understand minutiae, and also mine in other countries. There must be a challenge with the details that they have to fill in here. I'm getting a sense that it's not very clear, and that's why these
Let me tell you, Peter, those consultants, if those who want to come into the mining space can leave consultants, I think they can do better work. Because it's the same consultants who take forever, for whatever reasons. You'll find that they complain. I can show you, prove to you, to say these are the consultancies. Sometimes the people who make applications, they even come to us. We tell them, these are the issues, and they'll tell us that the consultant never told them.
So you're saying that experienced miners don't know how to fill in these forms?
No, we don't have experienced miners. Experienced miners, let me also say, there are many of them who own mines here who are experienced. We still go back to them because you'll find that as they submit, they are not fully compliant.
Can you make the form simpler then?
Well, the form, can it be simple in such an industry? The question of environmental liabilities, which we have to deal with, because we don't want to see ourselves creating the past where people become involved in mining and leave liability for the state. As we sit here today, we're speaking of a liability of about 6,000 areas which were never rehabilitated, because in the past people would mine and leave without taking responsibilities. So as government, one of the responsibilities is that as people mine, they must do it in a responsible way. They must make sure that they take liabilities. You know that we have a policy of the polluter pays. If they pollute, they must pay. And we are a country which is very dynamic, where issues of environment.
Minister, we're losing billions in terms of prospecting monies that could be coming, either because these forms are complex or that are just taking too long to process.
Well, let me help you with prospecting. It's not that people don't want to come and prospect. Prospecting, it's about mining a ground which you're not sure about. And that also creates a risk where people will say, we're not sure what we will find, whether we need to go in. As the state, through the Council for Geoscience, we're moving into that space of prospecting and making sure that we further map and clarify what is there on the ground. Government has allocated through Treasury. They've given Council for Geoscience 300 million as a start in ensuring that as a country we are able to identify what we have, but also bring certainty, because that's one of the areas, whilst they're looking at the licenses, but it's also about the risk which investors or those who wanted to come in were a bit skeptical in saying that they're not sure what they're risking. So we're trying also to bring certainty by investing as government in that space.
Right. I'm going to move on a little bit because we're going to run out of time, and I just want to touch on a few issues if we can, and then we'll put it to the audience. Let's talk about the miners, living conditions, jobs, etc. Before Marikana, those living conditions pre-existed. They were there for decades. And I'm just wondering why it was allowed to continue. Do you think that your department could have intervened a long time before Marikana?
Let me put the issue of living conditions. If you look at the charter, it addresses those issues. Where workers, we've agreed that we need to do away with single-sex hostels, and I am satisfied that the majority of the mining companies are on track when it comes to the living conditions in the mining industry. You know, your Lonmin, your Impala, they are on track, because we only agreed through the charter some 10 years ago. This is what we need in making sure that we improve the living conditions, but also we move away from the single-sex hostels where mine workers will be able even to bring their families to stay with them. So we're on track on that. But I think the biggest challenge which we have, it's the question of having to live with two families, because it's where they come from and where they work. And those are the pressures which workers faces. And that's the reality. That is why the issues of skilling workers, the issues of ensuring that workers are able to earn a good salary becomes the challenge. But one of the issues is to make sure that they are there with their families in making sure that their cost of living, it's not impacted by having to maintain too many homes.
How do you manage a miner who says, look, I don't want you to provide accommodation, I want you to give me a housing allowance, and then he doesn't use his housing allowance for decent accommodation?
I think that's the challenge the mining industry is facing. The employers and the unions will have to come back with a better scheme, because, you know, one of the issues, as you correctly say, that's what we saw at Ikaning, because most workers have a living allowance and they decide to go and live in the informal settlements. And that issue needs to be addressed to say, if you get a housing allowance, indeed, it goes to housing allowance. You build a house, because all industries, by the way, do offer housing allowances, and they can tell, here's a house, and in this case, we need that.
But can the mining companies then still be held liable? Because, you know, fingers are being pointed at them, but clearly it's not cut and dry.
Well, the mining companies will have to make sure and not turn a blind eye when they issue a housing allowance. It must be for housing allowances. If you go to BMW companies, when they issue a housing allowance, it goes to the housing subsidy instead of being used as an extension to a salary. So they need to be strict. The companies themselves will have to make sure that they collaborate with unions in making sure that whatever they pay goes to what it's meant for, not be used as an extension of salaries.
All right. I know you have a history of working with labor, working in the unions, so you understand how they work. And I'm just wondering, we're asking the employers to be serious and rethink. You're busy restructuring, redrafting regulation. What's your message to the unions themselves and the part that they need to play in changing the game in mining?
Well, same as the employers, unions have a responsibility. They also have to project the future. It can't be just about the employers. These are parties who have to cooperate and work together at all times. So every individual in that is, as a stakeholder, they have a responsibility. Workers, not only unions, including individual workers, must take responsibility to act in a responsible way. If money is meant for housing allowances, that's exactly what they need to discuss through their unions to say, how do they then make sure that they take responsibility, because they cannot continue living in squalor and also using money, which is supposed to be helping them in housing and improving their conditions of housing. So these are the issues which I think are key, Peter.
We've seen before Marikana that there was a history of illegal strikes, wildcat strikes that took place. And I'm just wondering, should action have been taken a lot before then? Because you almost see a culture of these strikes, and invariably they're violent. And I just wonder if a culture of impunity has been created. I was watching a report the other day, and I think it was in Dedorance, and the attitude was, if we're not violent, this is the language that government understands. They do nothing if we're not violent.
Well, I think we have a history in this country which we have to deal with. and which we have to address, it's violence. You know, it comes in many formats. It's not only in strikes. Look at what happened in the Western Cape recently. It's just a reflection of a society which all of us have to come together as a country in addressing that. It's not only the strikes, but I must also say we must know that the Constitution allows strikes, legal strikes to happen, but the violence, it's unacceptable. We've got to address that. We cannot just continue to see a moral decay because of the nature of the violence we're experiencing. And I hope that all of us as South Africans will come together to deal with that and say enough is enough. We can't continue, because whether it comes in a form of abuse, there's such a lot of violence in our country, and all of us, we've got to come together and say we must stop violence, including strikes. They must happen peacefully because the Constitution allows that, but violence, it cannot happen. It cannot be allowed to continue, because if we continue in this way, definitely this country is going in a wrong direction.
So what are you going to do?
Well, government is, through government and the ruling party, these issues have been discussed, and there are certain positions which have been taken. And I'm confident that with the approach which the ruling party and government are focusing on, we are moving on the right direction in dealing with violence in our country.
What do you say to people who say that the mining industry is being unfairly targeted when they have restructuring processes and they have to shed jobs? Because the numbers are saying, if I carry on with this amount of workers, I'm going to go out of business. You had quite a robust reaction when Amflat said that they needed to shed jobs. And I'm just wondering, I've seen jobs being shed in other sectors, manufacturing, financial services, but we haven't seen the same kind of response from government in terms of shedding jobs where necessary.
Well, I must say that I don't know what happens in those industries because I don't regulate them. I regulate the mining industry. What we've got to recognize is that in this particular sector, we have a history. And that is why I referred to modernization of the mining industry. One, this industry can no longer afford to make its profits on the backdrop of illiteracy, on the backdrop of unskilled individuals. They have a commitment. This is an industry which is over 100 years in this country, and it has been grown in a way that may lead us to where we are today. For us to change that, literacy must be the name of the game, but two, we also have to make sure that there's a balance between where mines are and local communities in working in the mines, because that has also a major bearing on the mining sector. So we've got to say, how do we reposition? That's why I'm talking about modernization, reposition as they restructure that. So some of the issues, it's also about the long-term plans by the companies themselves. One of the critical issues in any economy, there are ups and downs. How do mining companies project a 10-year plan as a company and saying within that particular process, they must anticipate there will be at some point where they will not be doing well, and how do they plan for that? Because they've got to plan for that. That's the reality of economics. You can't just continue to operate flat as if nothing can happen.
But should a miner consult you first, or just follow the laws that are there? There's Section 189, the procedure that they need to follow. If they follow those procedures, should they have to pick up the phone and say, Mining Minister, I'd like to consult with you because I have to shed 14,000 jobs?
The advantage with this sector, we don't consult when there's a challenge. We also talk when things are good, and we continue to talk when things are bad. So we don't wait for crisis. We don't wait for a particular situation if it does, we are already there. The platinum sector, we've been talking for a year. As we speak, we continue to talk because it's not only the companies themselves, it hurts the government, it hurts the country. We have an interest, the labor itself has an interest. So what we are saying to the mining companies, don't come to us when you've concluded, come to us when you're still facing the challenge, for us to develop a common vision and an approach which will be understood by everybody. We've done it in the past, we're still doing it, so what we don't agree, it's when a complete plan has been done by the company, then it comes to us. And I am positive that if we continue to do that, but also for the companies together with labor, utilizes what we refer to as future forums, future forums, projecting on the future for the workers themselves to understand what are the problems, how do they mitigate that together, not just giving 60 days, because it's not helping us. It creates a lot of tensions.
Do you acknowledge, though, that some mines are going to have to lose some jobs because they are operating at a margin and they can't control commodity prices? We're seeing platinum being recycled in a way that it hasn't been in the past, and that's a dimension they couldn't have predicted. And so some jobs are going to have to go. Do you acknowledge that at least?
Well, it's not about some jobs have to go. Planning, it's part of that. If you know that jobs are going to be shared, plan together with your workers and look at the projection of the future for you to create a stable environment. Gold has been shedding jobs for many, many years because they've done that responsibly. That's why we don't even read about it in the papers. So that's what we want. Understanding by workers why there need to be retrenchment, understanding workers that the company is not doing well, and what is it that makes the company not to do well. So on the basis of that, it means talk, talk, talk. Employers must not get tired of talking to its employees because they're also part of the company. They also contribute to the profitability of the company.
Are you worried at all that South Africa might lose out to other countries on the continent if the status quo continues? Because we're hearing that people are saying, look, it's so much easier in Botswana, it's so much easier in Angola, Ghana, wherever. Are we getting left behind?
We're not getting left behind. When I meet with African ministers, they envy South Africa because they think that we've learned a lot. We come from a past where mining happened in a way that it's unacceptable, and therefore they see us as a model for the rest of Africa. And I am confident that we are one and will continue to be one. If you look at Zambia, look at what happened in Zambia last year. It's precisely because you find investors coming in and starting to do how they started in South Africa. It can't pay. Investors must come and behave in a responsible way, must make sure that the local communities feel that they're part of the beneficiaries. But if they feel left out, indeed, mining will not be sustainable in Africa. And I think in this African century, we can't afford in any part of Africa to happen like it happened in South Africa. But they must come and take responsibility and have a shared responsibility together with those communities, together with the workers. And that will make sure that South Africa and the rest of Africa are sustainable. So they must not take shortcuts. They must do the right thing.
All right, just before we take a break, last question, and then we'll open the discussion to the floor. The relationship between the department and the industry. Some would say it's been strained. It's almost like an us and them kind of scenario. You talked about working together. Is there a way to bring you closer together?
I'm not sure, Peter, if there's a strain. There's no strain.
So there's lots of love.
There's lots of love. Also in love, you must also know that there are disagreements.
Right.
That does not mean you don't love each other anymore. You continue loving, but also you continue to disagree. It's a question of emphasis. It's a question of seeing things differently. But that does not mean there's a strain between us and the industry. We're working with them. We continue to engage. We'll be engaging tomorrow. So we have a dynamic relationship. That's what I must say. People read one incident and then decide to say this is what is happening. No, it's not true. We talk every day with the chamber.
All right, okay. Well, we'll be chatting to some of your boyfriends and girlfriends after the break. And also to our viewers as well. We'll get their views on the mining industry and some of the suggestions that they might have for you. So join us again right after this. Stay with us.